Hi, I'm Sinead from Nights of the Real, and this is part 2 of the Mythology of Horror. Most of the niceties of horror have been absorbed by more mainstream film genres. Monsters by action movies, serial killers by police procedurals, contagions by science fiction and dramas. Everything, that is, except horror's particular fascination with gore. Probably because graphic bloodshed is also precisely the quality that turns people away from the genre. Jump scares and the ability to disgust an audience are typically considered exploitative, cheap tricks that are meaningless to the story. But in film after film, gore and its accompanying violence are an integral element that motivates the very structure of the movie itself. Far from being a cheap trick, the vulnerability of the body triggers the camera's movement, how the shot is framed, and where it's cut. Most famously, Psycho's infamous shower scene uses manic editing, extreme angles, and chaotic sound design to fragment the film along with Marion's body. As the most graphic movie of its time, Psycho's frenetic editing reflected the shock of crossing a new threshold of fear in film. But horror isn't all chaos. These moments of disorientation are contrasted with long, often deeply focused shots that hold our attention, only to be punctuated with violence. The special effects are not, then, a stand-in for plot, but a dare to keep your eyes open.
Watch this.
So what you saw in Saw matters. Because disgust points to everything we shut out of our consciousness, everything we cannot or will not accept about ourselves and our lives. If mythology's central purpose is to reconcile us to the nature of life, horror may be the best suited genre to carry this out. As Robin Wood explains, because the great theme of horror is the struggle for recognition, and what horror dares us to recognize is that we are what we reject. And we reject life because it rarely conforms to our expectations of how we think it should be.
Even the most promising clues usually only lead to others. So many corpses roll away unrevenged.
We believe life should be fair, and bad things shouldn't happen to good people, and if only we had been in charge, we would have made life without pain, fear, guilt, and above all, death. But despite our arrogance, we are continually reminded that life is loss.
Hard to have anything, isn't it, Dr. Lecter? Rare to get it, hard to keep it. A damn slippery life.
So to protect us from staring into this bleak abyss, the ego creates powerful defenses, obsessions, and rituals that give us the illusion of control over our own lives. Because we identify totally with our own ego, we very often succeed in convincing ourselves that we can somehow control what happens to us and how we feel. Bill, in It, for example, clings to his conspiracy theories in order to avoid having to grieve the loss of his younger brother.
The Barrens. It's the only place that Georgie could have ended up.
He's gone, Bill.
But if the storm swept Georgie in, we should have gone.
He's gone! He's dead!
In the face of traumas that have already taken place, we struggle to redeem the past. Clarice, in Silence of the Lambs, is haunted by the childhood memory of lambs screaming during slaughter, and the guilt of her doomed attempt to save one of them.
And you think if you save poor Catherine, you could make them stop, don't you? You think if Catherine lives, you won't wake up in the dark ever again to that awful screaming of the lambs.
Against the tragedy that everything in life is a double-edged sword, we escape into fantasy. When even love can only ever be imperfect in the world, we conjure a better version of life. Like vampires, often the objects of romance, who triumph over death with immortality and promise a perfect love that can last forever.
Do you believe in destiny? That even the powers of time can be ordered for a single purpose.
But these defenses, no matter how clever, are illusions, and the only thing holding them together is the safety of our physical bodies. The ego is obsessed with the body, as it's a central element of your self-image and the boundaries of your self-concept of who you are, what you can and can't do, where you're from, and your experiences. The body protects the ego and its beliefs because it's the physical, visible proof that you're separate from others, and that we're therefore separate from life. Well, not so much the body that proves this separation, as our skin. The torn, open flesh in horror reveals the truth right beneath the surface. That under the skin is an overheated, bleeding factory, and the only thing hiding it from us is a fragile taboo against violence. So as skin tears, the film itself fragments, because it's really our illusions that are coming apart. And this is the point. As author Clive Barker explains, horror fiction shows us that every moment we teeter on chaos and oblivion. This is the truth that Gore and the open body pushes us to confront. That there are vast parts of ourselves that we do not know, of which we have no awareness, and yet on which our very existence depends.
So, coming that to order, which do you think? Bowels in or bowels out?
The leaking of the body's mysterious insides into sight is not a fascination with death. Blood, pus, bone, bodily fluids, bacteria and disease, pain and suffering are all signs of being alive. Life, then, is the primary horror of the genre. As Joseph Campbell puts it, life is a ferocious, unforgiving, horrendous presence, and it's inescapable. Campbell explains that even the organs of life have evolved to depend on the death of others for their existence, and the very nature of the organic cell is a pushing, self-protecting, malodorous, carnivorous, lecherous fever. It's the slow revelation of this shrouded truth that turns the romance of vampires into a terror, because their immortality confronts us with the reality that life feeds on life.
I condemn you to living death, to eternal hunger for living blood.
We only recoil at the sight of gore because we are terrified to admit that this eat or be eaten horror is what we are.
It's man devouring man, my dear. And who are we to deny it in here?
Even the fear of death isn't dread that flesh can rot, but that it's made to rot.
The tragedy is not to die, Abel, but to be wasted.
This fear is also why nothing causes more trouble and horror than sex.
For instance, number 1. You can never have sex. No! Big no-no! Big no!
I'm a dead man.
Sex equals death, okay?
Sex doesn't equal death because it's inherently sinful, but precisely because it's aggressively life-affirming. The ego transforms it into a punishable crime because we believe life itself is a mistake.
David and I are gonna have a baby. I hate this city.
To accept sex would be a confession that you're not separate but complicit in life's everyday brutalities, that you are part of the harmony of ritualized murder at the heart of nature. Horror thus betrays the foolishness of thinking we're above life's indecencies. This is partly why the medical profession is so often skewered in horror, because medicine often intellectualizes the body to avoid conceding our total enslavement to its needs. Consider the contrast between the sterilized aesthetics of the human centipede and the clinical exactness of Dr. Heider's language, with the psychological revulsion the reality of his ambition inspires. Ultimately, horror reveals that the taboo against breaking the body open isn't so much a taboo as it is an inevitable consequence of living. In Saw, Jigsaw's victims must willingly break this taboo and mutilate themselves in order to survive his death traps. But his victims aren't chosen randomly. They're people who, like Mia in Evil Dead, are so stuck on their own illusions and defenses that they're unable to live.
Most people are so ungrateful to be alive. But not you. Not anymore.
The series is labeled as torture porn in an attempt to be derogatory, but its gore, like all gore in horror, is meant to be a confrontation. Living is a slow act of self-mutilation. And if you want to live in peace, you have to find a way to accept what it takes to survive. So if the horror genre is sadistic, it's only because life is.